James Whitmore was 74 years old when his quiet life as a retired accountant collapsed under the weight of a secret he thought was buried forever. To his neighbors in Florida, he was the friendly old man who waved from his porch and handed out pies at church events. But to investigators who had reopened a string of brutal murders, he was something far darker, the barn butcher, a serial killer who had escaped justice for 45 years. The moment his DNA matched the evidence from those long cold cases, the mask he had worn for decades shattered, exposing the monster that had lived among ordinary people all along. The summer of 1977 should have been like any other in the small Ohio town. The fields were green, children rode their bikes along quiet streets, and life moved at a slow, comfortable pace. That peace was shattered when a farmer discovered something he would never forget. In the corner of his abandoned barn, half hidden beneath broken boards and scattered hay, lay the body of a young woman. The sight was so brutal that he ran from the building before returning with the sheriff. Word spread quickly, and within hours the once quiet farmland was surrounded by flashing police lights and onlookers too frightened to get close. Investigators combed through the barn with the tools they had at the time, which were far more limited than today. The woman's injuries were unlike anything the local police had ever seen. There were small, deliberate cuts on her arms and chest, as though someone had wanted to leave a mark. Detectives whispered about the possibility of ritual or obsession. To the public, the details were kept vague, but whispers traveled fast in a small town. Everyone suddenly felt less safe in their own homes. The victim was soon identified as a college student who had been missing for 3 days. She was bright, full of ambition, and loved by her family, which made the crime all the more horrifying. Questions spread: how had she ended up in the barn, and why had she been chosen? There were no clear suspects, no witnesses, and almost no physical evidence that could point the investigation in a direction. What should have been the height of summer freedom now became the start of a long nightmare. Residents who once left their doors unlocked began to fear the dark, realizing that someone dangerous was hiding among them. Over the next 5 years, fear took root in the town as more bodies appeared, each one discovered in places that once seemed ordinary and safe. A wooded trail where families went hiking, a cornfield on the edge of town, the narrow banks of a river where teenagers gathered in summer, each location became a crime scene marked by tape and silence. At first, no one connected the murders. The victims seemed different from one another: students, young workers, women passing through on road trips. But the deeper police looked, the clearer it became that a pattern was forming. Each victim vanished at night, often after being seen walking alone or heading to their car. They were always found within a 20-mile radius of the first crime scene. Most disturbing were the strange markings left on their bodies, small cuts in precise shapes that investigators struggled to understand. The press seized on this grim detail, calling it the killer's signature. Reporters began writing about a shadowy figure they nicknamed the barn butcher, linking the killings back to the first body found in that abandoned barn. As the murders continued, fear transformed into obsession. Parents forbade their children from walking alone after dark, curfews became stricter, and local businesses closed early. People began carrying weapons they had never needed before, convinced the killer could strike anywhere, anytime. Rumors spread about who it might be: a stranger passing through, a recluse living on the outskirts, even a trusted neighbor. Everyone looked at one another differently, suspicious glances replacing friendly waves. For investigators, the frustration was crushing. They had no solid leads, no reliable eyewitnesses, and no modern forensic tools to trace the evidence. The town lived in the shadow of a predator who always seemed one step ahead, leaving behind only terror and mystery. As the investigation stretched into the early 1980s, the energy that once fueled detectives began to fade. In the first years after the killings, every new piece of information had been treated like a breakthrough, but by now, the optimism was gone. Reports piled high on desks, each one leading nowhere. Witnesses contradicted each other, and the descriptions they gave could have matched almost anyone in town. Tips arrived from across the state, but each one collapsed under scrutiny. For every door investigators opened, there were 10 more that slammed shut. The killer seemed to leave just enough behind to terrify, but never enough to be caught. The tools available at the time only added to the frustration. Forensics in the late 1970s and early 1980s relied on fingerprints, handwriting samples, and blood typing, none of which provided solid connections. Fibers and shoe impressions were collected, but they were too common to trace back to a single person. Even the strange marks carved into the victims offered no clear answers. Investigators debated whether they were symbols, initials, or simply the killer's way of mocking them. None of it brought them closer to the truth. By the middle of the decade, the killings suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the crimes themselves. Families of victims waited for another announcement, another tragedy, but none came. Detectives wondered if the killer had died, been imprisoned for something unrelated, or simply moved on to a new hunting ground. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. As time passed, resources shifted to other cases. Younger officers inherited boxes of files stacked in evidence rooms, but without new leads, the momentum was gone. What had once been the town's most urgent manhunt had now become a haunting reminder of a predator who had slipped away unseen. By the late 1990s, the killings had faded from headlines, but they never disappeared from memory. In the small Ohio town, the story of the barn butcher became part of local folklore. Parents told their children not to stray too far at night, repeating the warnings their own parents once gave them. Teenagers dared one another to visit the old barn where the first victim was found, treating it like a haunted landmark. What had once been real terror was now spoken of in hushed tones, as if the passage of time had turned the nightmare into a chilling legend. Still, for the families of the victims, there was nothing mythical about the loss. They attended every memorial, lit candles on anniversaries, and carried photographs of loved ones whose lives had ended too soon. In town squares, murals of the victims appeared, painted by local artists determined not to let their faces be forgotten. Some families left the area, unable to walk the same streets where their children had vanished, while others stayed, determined to demand answers until the truth was found. For law enforcement, the case was a scar that refused to heal. Officers who had worked the original investigation often spoke of it with quiet shame, haunted by the fact that a killer had lived among them and escaped. Younger detectives inherited the files but lacked the tools to push forward, leaving them stacked in evidence rooms like reminders of failure. Yet beneath the sadness, a strange sense of normal life carried on. Businesses grew, new families moved in, and the town tried to reinvent itself. But the shadow of the barn butcher never fully lifted. Every unsolved detail lingered in the background, a ghostly reminder that the story was unfinished and the truth still waiting to be uncovered. In 2019, everything changed when advances in forensic science breathed new life into the long-forgotten case. Boxes of evidence that had been gathering dust for decades were pulled out of storage. Fibers, hairs, and scraps of clothing were carefully re-examined under powerful new technology that detectives in the 1970s could never have imagined. At first, expectations were low. Many items had degraded over time, and countless old cases had led to disappointment when tested again. But this time, something remarkable surfaced. Among the preserved evidence was a fingernail scraping taken from one of the earliest victims. For years, it had been useless, too small, and too contaminated to analyze. Yet with modern DNA sequencing, scientists were able to separate and identify the genetic material. When the profile appeared on the computer screen, investigators knew they had finally uncovered the hidden thread that connected every murder. The breakthrough was monumental. For the first time, the barn butcher was not just a phantom haunting the town's history but a person with a biological fingerprint. Detectives, both old and new, gathered to review the discovery. Some had worked the case decades earlier and could hardly believe the nightmare that had plagued them for so long might finally have an ending. Others, too young to remember the murders, suddenly felt the weight of responsibility fall on their shoulders. The DNA profile was clear and strong, but it didn't match anyone already in the National Criminal Database. That meant the killer had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to provide a sample. The investigation reached a new crossroads. Traditional methods had failed in the past, but technology had opened a door. The only question left was how far they were willing to go to trace. Detectives turned to a new and controversial tool: genetic genealogy. The DNA profile extracted from the victim's fingernail was uploaded to a public genealogy database where people voluntarily shared their genetic information to trace family histories. Within hours, small connections appeared: distant relatives, fragments of family trees, partial matches scattered across the country. None of them were the killer, but each was a piece of the larger puzzle. Specialists in genetic mapping began charting out branches of related families. They built diagrams that stretched across walls, linking second cousins to great-grandparents, tracing lines through marriages, births, and deaths. Slowly, the family tree narrowed, eliminating those who were too young, too old, or had lived far from Ohio during the murders. After months of careful work, the branches pointed to one man who fit perfectly within the timeline. He had lived in the area during the late 1970s and early 1980s, only miles away from where the bodies were found. What startled investigators most was that his name had never once appeared in the original case files. He wasn't a known troublemaker, never questioned, never even rumored to be suspicious. To neighbors and co-workers, he was just another face in the crowd. But the science was undeniable: every clue from the DNA pointed directly to him. Detectives dug into his past, piecing together his movements during those years. They found he had quietly relocated out of state in the mid-1980s, just after the killings stopped. The sudden disappearance fit perfectly with the murder's ending. After decades of silence, the phantom figure who had once terrorized the community now had an identity on paper. For the first time, investigators could see the shadow behind the legend, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they confronted him. The man investigators identified was now in his 70s, living a quiet life in a small Florida suburb. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, almost forgettable. He was a retired accountant who spent his mornings tending to a well-kept garden and his afternoons sitting on a porch swing, waving at neighbors as they passed. To the people around him, he was kind, polite, and dependable. He baked pies for church events, donated to local charities, and helped neighbors carry groceries. Nothing about him suggested the violent past hidden in the shadows of another state. When detectives began digging deeper, they found his life had been carefully built to avoid suspicion. He had moved to Florida decades earlier, bought a modest house, and blended seamlessly into the community. He had no criminal record, no major incidents with the law, not even a traffic violation that stood out. It was as though he had erased his former self the moment he left Ohio, burying his past beneath layers of normal routines and neighborly charm. The contrast was chilling. While families in Ohio still mourned the lives he had stolen, he was enjoying the comfort of a peaceful retirement. Children in his neighborhood played in his yard, never realizing the danger that once surrounded him. He was praised as a reliable member of the community, even considered a role model for younger men who admired his calm and steady nature. For investigators, this normalcy made the discovery even more disturbing. The barn butcher was not some wild-eyed drifter or obvious predator. He was a man who had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, carrying on with an ordinary life while his crimes faded into legend. What no one around him knew was that his past was about to catch up with him in the most dramatic way. Detectives knew they couldn't approach recklessly. After decades of waiting, they needed proof strong enough to hold in court. A surveillance team was assigned to quietly observe his daily routine. They followed him from his tidy suburban home to grocery stores, pharmacies, and his weekly church services. Every movement was documented, every stop recorded. To the casual eye, he was nothing more than an old man enjoying his retirement, but to investigators, each outing was a potential chance to collect the evidence that would seal his fate. Patience paid off. One evening, he stopped at a local diner for coffee, a place he visited often. He lingered at the counter, chatted casually with the waitress, and eventually left a half-empty cup on the table. When he walked out the door, detectives waited until the coast was clear. The cup was bagged carefully and rushed to a lab for testing. The tension was unbearable as investigators waited for results, knowing that everything rested on whether the DNA matched what had been preserved for more than 4 decades. When the report came back, it was undeniable. The saliva on the rim of the cup matched the DNA pulled from beneath the fingernails of the barn butcher's earliest victims. There was no margin for error, no room for doubt. The ghost that had haunted Ohio for so long was finally tied to a real man with a real name. The discovery electrified the task force. After years of silence, the case was no longer unsolved. Still, they moved cautiously. They continued surveillance, documenting his habits and searching for any hidden evidence. Behind the calm image he projected to his neighbors, detectives now saw the truth, a predator who thought he had buried his past forever. The countdown to his arrest had begun. At dawn, the quiet Florida neighborhood woke to flashing lights as unmarked cars rolled silently into position. Detectives and federal agents had coordinated the arrest for weeks, waiting until they had every detail in place. The man, now gray-haired and frail in appearance, opened his front door expecting nothing more than another routine morning. Instead, he was met with the sight of armed officers surrounding his property. His confusion quickly shifted to shock as his hands were pulled behind his back and cold steel cuffs clicked shut. After 45 years of evasion, the barn butcher was finally in custody. Neighbors emerged from their homes in disbelief. To them, this was the man who waved kindly every morning, the man who shared vegetables from his garden, the man who seemed incapable of harm. They whispered among themselves as he was led down his driveway, stunned that the friendly retiree they thought they knew was accused of being one of the most elusive killers in the country's history. Some shook their heads in denial, while others stared in silence, unsettled by how easily someone could hide behind an ordinary face. Inside the home, investigators found chilling proof that erased any remaining doubt. In the garage, tucked neatly into boxes, were personal items that didn't belong to him: necklaces, hair ties, and handwritten letters. Each item was later linked to victims whose lives had been stolen decades earlier. These trophies revealed the truth he had kept hidden. Even in his new life, he had carried pieces of the past with him, reminders of the crimes he thought would never resurface. For law enforcement, the arrest marked the end of a nightmare that had haunted generations. For the families of the victims, it was the moment they had feared might never come. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. The trial quickly became a national spectacle, drawing reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and grieving families into the same courtroom. For weeks, every seat was filled, and the air carried a heavy mix of anger, anticipation, and sorrow. Prosecutors presented the evidence with precision: the DNA match, the hidden trophies found in his garage, the timeline of his movements that aligned with each disappearance. Piece by piece, they painted a picture of a man who had lived two lives, one as a neighbor and community member, and another as a calculating predator who terrorized a town and vanished without a trace. Family members of the victims sat only feet away from him, holding framed photographs of the loved ones they had lost decades earlier. Some wept quietly as old crime scene images were displayed on large screens, while others stared at the man with cold intensity, unwilling to let him forget the devastation he caused. The weight of 4 decades of unanswered questions filled the courtroom, every testimony pressing heavier on the man who sat motionless in his chair. His defense team tried to cast doubt, pointing to his age, his quiet retirement, and the lack of direct witnesses. But the DNA spoke louder than any argument. The genetic trail that had been invisible in the 1970s now stood as undeniable proof. Jurors listened carefully, their faces unreadable, yet the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell into complete silence. The jury found him guilty on all counts. Families clutched one another, tears streaming as relief mixed with grief. For the man once known as the barn butcher, the facade of normal life had crumbled forever. His fate was sealed, not by rumor or speculation, but by science and persistence that refused to let his crimes stay buried. When the verdict was announced, the families of the victims felt a complicated wave of emotions wash over them. Relief came first, because the man who had haunted their lives for decades was finally found guilty. But grief followed close behind, heavier than before, because nothing could return the years they had lost or the loved ones who never came home. Parents who had grown old waiting for answers clutched faded photographs in their hands, their faces wet with tears. Some whispered that justice had come too late, while others believed that late was better than never. The town itself reacted with a mix of sorrow and closure. Memorials were held in churches and public squares, where bells rang out for each victim. Candles lined the steps of City Hall, flickering in the night as names were read aloud. For the first time, there was no speculation, no rumor, no whisper of uncertainty. The barn butcher was no longer a faceless shadow but a man who had been unmasked and condemned. News crews returned to the quiet Ohio community, capturing images of people standing shoulder to shoulder, remembering lives taken too soon. Old scars reopened, but there was comfort in finally knowing the truth. For many, the verdict allowed them to begin healing in ways they had never been able to before. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case early in their careers also stood among the crowd. Some admitted to feeling guilt for not catching him sooner, but the conviction gave them a sense of redemption. The story that had once defined their failure now ended with justice delivered. Though time could never be rewound, the community finally had an answer. After 45 years, the silence that had hung over the town was finally broken. In prison, time moved slowly, and for the first time in decades, he had no way to control the world around him. The man who once dictated the fate of his victims now lived under the constant gaze of guards, locked in a cell where every movement was restricted. Stripped of his carefully built life and his friendly mask, he was forced to confront the truth he had spent years burying. He was not the harmless retiree his neighbors thought they knew. He was the barn butcher, and there was no escape from that reality anymore. As the days turned into months, the weight of recognition grew heavier. The walls of his cell echoed with memories he could not silence. Each trophy found in his garage, each scar left on a victim, each headline printed during the trial became a reminder of the past he had tried to erase. He no longer controlled the narrative, the world had seen him for what he truly was. For the first time, he realized the full scope of what it meant to be caught, not just arrested, but exposed, unmasked, and condemned. Outside prison walls, life continued. Families of victims visited memorials, holding gatherings that honored the lives stolen so many years earlier. The town, once silenced by fear, finally breathed easier knowing the shadow that had haunted it was gone. The community found a sense of closure, even if the wounds could never completely heal. Alone in his cell, he understood that his freedom had been nothing more than borrowed time. 45 years of pretending to be someone else had ended in chains and truth. The final punishment was not only the sentence he carried but the knowledge that history would forever remember him not as a kind old man, but as the killer he truly was.